Hi, this is Trey Kay, and I thought I'd start this show off with a little walk up memory lane. This is a hill near the neighborhood where I grew up in Charleston, West Virginia, and I'm going to take a hike for old time's sake. And as I walk, you can hear me huffing and puffing because this is a very steep incline.
You got a lighter?
No, I don't. Someone just asked me if I had a lighter. If I had a lighter, I probably wouldn't have the wind to walk up this hill. Now, I'm not taking you on this stroll just to show off my cardio abilities. I'm actually here to see what's at the top of the hill. The school bus just went by. When I was a kid, I used to ride the bus to John Adams Junior High School. And at the foot of the hill, that's where all the kids who lived up here had to walk down this really long hill. This is Oakwood Terrace, and it was built when I was a kid back in the 1970s. When this low-income housing complex was built, it was a big deal. Oakwood Terrace went up as the government was building the interstate highway through Charleston. The city raised its majority black neighborhoods for construction, displacing many low-income families. Oakwood Terrace Apartments was the first affordable housing project built in the more affluent, mostly white part of town. A development like this, built by the government specifically for low-income residents, is really a thing of the past.
There were a lot of problems with urban renewal, and there were a lot of problems with public housing. It wasn't set up to succeed in some ways. I think in many places it was very segregated. It ended up concentrating poverty.
That's Claudia Aiken. She directs the Housing Initiative, a research program at the University of Pennsylvania.
So mistakes were made, and we retrenched. We decided that wasn't the model that we were going to do anymore. So we went a couple different ways, but I think the thing that unifies those different ways is that they rely on the market and essentially on capitalism.
Where we live often plays a huge part in defining us. And yet, when I think about housing, it's a topic shrouded in complexity, in economics, and sometimes social conflict.
Housing is a human right. This is our housing, but leave us alone. What do we want? Housing. When do we want it? Now.
Who can live where? How does regulation affect our housing choices? Some of the things that define our housing disparities became more evident during the pandemic.
The hot housing market is forcing potential buyers to keep renting, and it comes as home prices continue to soar.
You may know that I split my time between West Virginia and New York. Two very different settings, often framed at odds with each other. In this episode, we'll travel to a couple of very different American communities, one urban and the other rural, to talk about housing. From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show where we talk about what's dividing Americans. I'm Trey Kay. I can't believe I'm saying this, but America is heading into the fourth year of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a crisis that continues to affect many aspects of our lives, including where we live.
Housing became really important during the pandemic. Not only were we trapped here all of the time and working from home increasingly, but also housing was really at stake in a way that it might not previously have been. And
Claudia Aiken says the pandemic is shaping American housing in very different ways.
people who were doing fine before were still doing fine. Many of them were doing even better, what with the stimulus checks and the housing boom in home ownership. A lot of home values really went up and people benefit, when the value of their asset goes up. But then you have the other side of the spectrum where people who were struggling before, especially renters, suddenly they had no income and couldn't pay the rent. So in terms of income, the pandemic really affected certain sectors, mostly people in service. Those are disproportionately renters, and suddenly they had no income, they couldn't pay rent. So they were in this situation where they were actually having to ask themselves the question, can I stay in my home for another month?
At the start of the pandemic, the federal government invested in housing in a way that it hasn't for decades.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the CARES Act.
Billions were poured into rent relief programs.
There's $4 billion for emergency grants for homelessness and $1 billion for project-based rental assistance.
People's rental arrears went down. Their anxiety about being able to stay in their home went down. They weren't, for example, sleeping in vehicles or in motels.
But these days, emergency pandemic federal relief programs are mostly gone.
Our research also finds that that rent relief was essentially a Band-Aid. It was not meant to be a long-term solution, and it wasn't. So as we're following people now, months after they received that rent relief, a lot of them are still struggling in really important ways.
Once again, America is staring down the barrel of its long-term housing issues, only now with added complications from the last few years. Take the rental market. Overall, price hikes slowed over 2022, but nationally, costs are still well above what they were pre-COVID. And if you're trying to buy a house, that's gotten more complicated too. In response to inflation and the housing boom of 2021, the government raised interest rates on mortgages, making it more expensive to buy. Plus, American wages haven't kept up with inflation. Add the two together, and you get a set of hurdles many Americans simply can't afford. Aiken says a lot of this turmoil can be tied back to one problem.
We don't have enough housing. And when you've got that shortage, there's more competition for it and prices go up.
Are we seeing that demand cooling off?
I think it's fair to say there was some counter movement during the pandemic, but that's the last, 2 to 3 years. But in terms of the last decade, when I think of a city like Philadelphia, for example, that had been depopulating for years and years and years following the Industrial Revolution, which, seems like ancient history. In the last decade is when the city was kind of reborn and saw people moving in greater numbers for the very first time. And that shifted the housing market totally, and in a way that the city might not have totally been prepared for.
And that is how I ended up on I-95 South, heading towards the city of brotherly love. So I'm walking down the street here in Philadelphia with my friend and producer, Christina Stella.
Hi.
We're walking in West Philadelphia in a neighborhood called Squirrel Hill.
I lived here when I was in my early 20s, and that's a common story that you're going to hear about this neighborhood. It's right near the University of Pennsylvania. It has a long and checkered past outside of that, but this is kind of a place where a lot of young people come to maybe rent their first apartments, live in their first house with friends from college, or while they're studying at the university. You've got Drexel University, University of the Sciences, University of Pennsylvania here.
West Philly's growth was underpinned by the invention of public transit.
That's the trolley there.
Depending on the block, you might see vast 6 to 10 room homes with turrets, Queen Anne molding, and bright paint jobs. Head a few blocks south or west, and it's mostly smaller row homes.
It has a long and rich history of, at first, being a place where wealthy, moneyed people had their big Victorians. And over the course of the 20th century, it increasingly became a place where working class people lived.
So is that something that happens here? Some of these old Victorian homes here that used to be homes for one family has been divvied up into multiple family homes?
Oh, absolutely. And that's also been part of the gentrification, too. I mean, there have been, real estate companies that have come in and bought up these properties, divvied them up into apartments, and over the course of the last 10 to 20 years, raise the rents and raise the rents and raise the rents. And so now, kind of more than ever, affordability is a conversation that people are having in West Philadelphia and the city at large.
We've talked about gentrification before on this show, the phenomenon where lower income, less resourced neighborhoods are revitalized. But when the cost of living goes up, the original residents increasingly can't afford it anymore. That's disproportionately a problem for minority communities. People need cheaper housing, so they leave, taking decades of local culture and history with them. That story has unfolded here in West Philly, too, where, depending on the block you're walking, the Black population has fallen anywhere from 30 to 50% over the past 10 years. That reminded me of something Claudia Aiken explained.
Before Philadelphia started to experience this kind of renaissance that it's in now, there were decades of white flight and abandonment and a shrinking working population, and that meant a shrinking tax revenue as well. When you see your tax revenue go down, it essentially means each year you're cutting services, and people are seeing the abandonment of basic aspects of city life, like having your trash picked up. In the last 10 years, that trend of depopulation finally reversed, but it's a complicated trend. And in neighborhoods that had become majority Black, for example, had vibrant communities, they were having to struggle with now an influx of higher income people who were here for the hospitals and for the universities, and how to accommodate them.
Aiken says that's led to a boom in housing development across the city, particularly luxury projects.
Not just around, Center City, but also spreading to neighborhoods around the universities, South Philly now as well. I mean, it's just spreading outward, and there's always kind of a new frontier of gentrification happening in Philadelphia that people are pointing to.
And yet, while many share the belief that Philly needs more housing, there's less agreement about what kind of housing the city should put up.
This has been a neighborhood that's seen rapid change over the last 10 to 20 years. And with that, debate over developments like this one at 48th and Chester.
It's a big lot, lined with a black gate and some shrubbery that could use a good pruning. In 2020, the owners of this property proposed building a 76-unit apartment building. What perhaps they didn't expect is that 3 years later, nobody knows if it will ever get built. It wasn't the pandemic or bureaucracy or money that got in the way of this development. Neighbors have fought for years over this project, and I wanted to find out why. Taylor Kessinger is a researcher in the University of Pennsylvania's biology department. He lives near the lot at 48th and Chester, but growing up, his environment could not have looked less like West Philly. He grew up in suburban California, surrounded by strip malls and busy roads.
For the most part, you're asking your mom or dad to drive you somewhere.
He didn't love it, but it didn't weigh on him too much, until he moved away as a young adult.
I went to college, and I think college is many people's first experience with the kind of smart, walkable, mixed-use urbanism that's illegal to build in many American cities. And then I actually went to grad school in Germany. It was a traditional town with sort of shops and houses right next to each other. I was kind of amazed at how pleasant of an experience that was compared to many American cities.
He shares a one-bedroom apartment with his wife and baby. And in his spare time, Kessinger advocates for housing development in the city of Philadelphia, especially the project at 48th and Chester.
I'm probably infamously one of the most vocal supporters of this building.
But the lot in question wasn't actually zoned for a big apartment building. Instead, it's earmarked for single-family or duplex homes.
If they want to build in a way that's contrary to the zoning code. For example, because it's denser or taller or doesn't have as much parking or doesn't have as big setbacks, then they have to ask the zoning board of adjustment for permission.
And Kessinger says those zoning meetings are where the trouble started.
Good afternoon. Please identify yourself, first and last name, and I'll swear you in.
I remember being surprised at how many folks were opposed to building apartments on that lot. From my point of view, and from the point of view of, I think, many urbanists in Philadelphia, it was kind of a slam dunk project.
But not in the eyes of many neighbors. Dozens started attending local and community zoning meetings to protest the construction, like this one in June of 2021.
I'm in total opposition to this project.
This is not an asset to the existing community here.
The grounds for the neighbors' opposition are substantial and speak directly to the proposal's negative impacts on their quality of life. Among these, a net loss of green space, greater traffic congestion, and increased parking difficulties.
Many also complained that the new building would further gentrify the neighborhood, particularly because most of these apartments would be rented at market rate.
The neighborhood loses more affordable apartments than new development provides.
In Philadelphia, the average one-bedroom goes for around $1,500. Depending on the size, the rent for the new units would be between $1,300 and $2,200.
The market rate units in it would be more expensive than, I think, almost any other unit in the neighborhood. But the neighbors managed to compel the developer to set aside 20% of the units at rents that are very good for the neighborhood.
That agreement was between Cedar Park Neighbors, an organization Kessinger's affiliated with, and the developer. Both parties agreed the new building would provide 15 units at so-called affordable prices. That's 40% of the area median income for the next 50 years. That would put rents for the apartments between $725 and $870 a month. But in some ways, the affordable units agreement ended up causing even more strife. In that same June 2021 meeting, some neighbors said they felt left out of the negotiation process.
When I asked Mr. Feldman to share details of the community agreement, he refused.
That's not true.
No, that's true. Mr. Feldman, please do not interrupt.
Please
do not.
Please do not speak over each other. How many more do we have, Tanya?
And this is where the neighborhood does have a little bit of leverage. If they are able to come together and present a united front to the developer, then they have an argument in favor of the zoning board. They can say, look, we made these reasonable demands and the developer wasn't able to meet them. We think you shouldn't grant these variances. And if they aren't able to do this, then the developer can turn around and say, look, we tried to be reasonable, but these folks went full NIMBY on us. There's no reasoning with them.
And that word, NIMBY, is one you'll hear in housing debates across the country. Taylor says the acronym for Not in My Backyard is mostly used as a pejorative.
It maybe is unfair to refer to everyone who is opposed to a particular development or development in general for that matter as NIMBY. Because I think a lot of these folks are just scared. They're scared about potential changes to their neighborhood and the material impact that they think it could have for them.
And on the other side of the coin, you have what Kessinger calls himself, a YIMBY, as in, yes, in my backyard.
This is something that people actually believe in, that housing costs have gotten out of control, and that if you want to rein them in, then you should allow more of it to be built, and that the market has a role to play in that.
But people don't always oppose or support developments for the same reasons.
It's an issue that's sort of at an angle to the traditional left-right political axis, because there are folks who are definitely NIMBY for explicitly right-wing reasons, like they don't want apartments in their exclusionary suburb because the apartments bring people with lower income, they bring crime or whatever. There are folks who are NIMBY or anti-YIMBY for more left-wing reasons because they think that development will raise land values and raise rents, that it could put people at risk of rent hikes and displacement. It's interesting because on the one hand, you'll see people oppose development because development could lower property values. And on the other hand, you'll see people oppose development because development could raise property values and therefore property taxes. And that's especially a relevant concern in a city like Philadelphia, where there's a very high rate of lower income black home ownership.
The fight has become less about the development project itself and more about whether the project reflects the neighborhood's shared values.
I've actually been accused of being paid by the landowner to move to the neighborhood and shill for this building.
Including what those values are.
I remember one meeting that was actually with the developer and the architect, I think. There was some actual shouting to the effect of, do you know any poor people? Do you know what it's like to be poor?
Supporters say this project represents something new, a chance to try out a progressively branded housing policy. But critics claim this experiment is more of the same harm that's besieged the city for years. One group in particular, Protect Squirrel Hill, has even protested at the site.
So I'm so happy to see all of y'all here today.
That's how I met Ron White, a lifelong Philadelphian and activist who lives not too far from Taylor Kessinger. Can you tell me about the West Philly that you grew up in?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a mixed picture because the area where I grew up in mostly was near the zoo, and there was a lot of crime, there was a lot of drug activity. But that's because the neighborhood had been pretty much abandoned by the city, so there were no services for people. You know, this is back during the crack epidemic was happening in the 80s and early 90s. So there were a lot of challenges in the neighborhood where I grew up.
White moved around the area as a kid, but as a young adult, he moved back to West Philly.
Well, I used to live in a building that used to be a church, rectory, and school that was owned by the Catholic Church. It was like a complex, and it was abandoned for years. It was bought, I think, in the early 90s or late 80s by people who wanted to have, you know, affordable housing in the neighborhood. So they renovated it and so forth. And that's where I was living beginning in 2008.
White lived there for about 10 years. It's about a mile from where we're sitting. And during that time, Philly saw its first growth in decades. The city changed its tax laws, which encouraged developers to build new housing and businesses. He remembers how the skyline of University City, the area where he was living, started to really fill out.
And what I noticed is that just the way I could see out of my window, I could see the development happening month by month.
Eventually, the faces around his building changed too. More students, particularly from white and Asian backgrounds, and fewer long-term black residents like himself.
And they just decided to, I think they call it renoviction, where they decide to renovate, and that's a way that they push people out, is by saying, look, we have added this amenity, or we have fixed the doors, we have painted, or something like that. And now because we painted, we have to raise the rent by $500 a month, which is, for a lot of people living there, wasn't really, you know, affordable.
Was that incremental? Did you get a letter? How did they let you know?
It was incremental, but also my situation was I did have a housing voucher.
White is talking about the federal Section 8 housing program. The government gives low-income households a voucher for rental housing and gets the landlord to accept it for part of the rent.
So the voucher means that you only pay a certain amount of your income.
In Philadelphia, nearly 20,000 households pay their rent with a Section 8 voucher. 80% of those recipients are black.
And a lot of landlords in developing neighborhoods don't want to accept the vouchers because they associate the voucher with like low-income people who are criminals or something like that. So I had to basically give up the voucher because they're saying you can only use the voucher in places where the landlords accept it.
White ended up living miles away in a different neighborhood until a room in his current place opened up. He lives in an old Victorian with 5 roommates. He's a short walk away from the proposed building at 48th and Chester. Among all the criticisms levied at the project, White says his opposition is rooted in justice. He's not a fan of the 20% affordability deal. For starters, he doesn't like the way it went down.
The developers went to a specific community association that did support this development, which only represents maybe a small handful of people. And they latched onto these people and said, look, we have community support for this because this small handful of people supports this. Meanwhile, they were ignoring the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of signatures denying support for this. So I feel like that's kind of helping to kind of foment distrust in the community, because people are like, well, why do you support this, and who supports this, and like who really supports this? So it kind of like creates a situation where you're like looking over your shoulder at your neighbor. Are you in on this too? And no one really knows.
Which brings us to White's other major concern: the numbers used to calculate what those affordable units will cost. For him, they don't go far enough.
When these projects are mentioned, they always try to sell it by saying that, oh, we have 20 units that will be affordable. But usually that baseline of affordability is not really affordable for a lot of families in the city because of the poverty level here. And then there's also the case of, well, why can't we just have affordable housing point blank, like an affordable housing building? Why does it always have to be mixed use, or why do we have to just sort of cater to what the developers want? Why can't we actually provide what people really need, which is housing in this neighborhood? But it seems like you can't have anything here unless you can afford to pay for it, so that's sort of how things work, you know.
And initially, this conflict was playing out fairly quietly in West Philly, if not tensely. That is until the spring of 2021, when people in the area started getting some unusual mail. That's coming up after a break. You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and this is Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Okay, so do you remember where we were? We were talking about a development project in Philadelphia that's become a focal point in the battle over the city's need for housing. Now, picture this. You go to your mailbox, and there is a letter. It's stapled to a flyer. You pick it up. Here's some of what it says. Dear neighbor, we understand you may be concerned about the development at 48th Street and Chester Avenue. We are collaborating with biomedical researchers to investigate if the development would adversely affect neighbors' microbiota and increase the risk of colorectal cancer. So, I've heard about the poop story. How did that come about? How did it unfold?
Yeah, so I think an assistant professor of biology at Temple University sent out mailers soliciting poop samples to fight gentrification.
Yep, you heard that right. About a year ago, some West Philly residents got a letter that claimed a research project would look at potential connections between the residential development and colorectal cancer.
There are sort of two aspects to this. The first is your poop is full of bacteria. Those are the bacteria that grow in your intestines. And which bacteria are there and in what measure has all sorts of weird effects on your health. And the theory there, as I understand it, was that irresponsible development could kick up particulates and lead to economic stress, both of which could have adverse effects on the gut microbiota. So folks received these very strange flyers soliciting poop samples for this research project. Chadwick Boseman's name was invoked.
As in the beloved Hollywood actor who starred as Black Panther in the Marvel superhero movie. In 2020, Boseman died of colon cancer when he was 43.
It was very strange. No one knew what to make of it. I think a lot of the residents in the neighborhood were a little weirded out by it.
The story blew up in local news. People dubbed the project the Poop Building.
I thought it was funny. I actually thought the research project was kind of interesting. I mean, the manner in which those samples were solicited was a little strange, and it was oddly appropriate that the building in question that this RCO was opposed to was going on the site of a former dog park, right? So dog park, dog poop, poop samples to fight gentrification. It was like a perfect storm of poop, I guess.
Ultimately, it came out that the supposed study was not actually backed by any research institutions. In a statement, Squirrel Hills City Council Representative Jamie Gauthier criticized the flyers, saying they could instill fear in residents. Others dubbed it as extreme NIMBYism. For longtime Philadelphia resident Ron White, the effort seems to suggest just how desperate some people were to shut down the housing project.
So they were trying to use science basically as a way of undergirding their opposition to this. And then it just became all about this maybe weird angle that they tried to use to take down this developer. But I do think that other issues kind of got lost or overshadowed because of the focus on that, I mean, it's kind of salacious,
Taylor Kessinger says it wasn't always like this.
I think actually when this development was first proposed, the main thing that everyone agreed on was that they cared about the neighborhood remaining affordable.
As an outsider to Philadelphia and its housing challenges, this is where the typical YIMBY-NIMBY dichotomy starts to fall apart for me. This is a story about people who do and don't want their neighborhood to change for all kinds of reasons. But Ron White suggests the housing development signifies more than just personal preference.
We're in a confrontation moment in this country where there's a lot of social problems that are now, we can't no longer put it on the back burner. Now we really have to deal with these problems. And I think this housing issue in Philadelphia is like an example of that. The way the city government works here and the way that things are arranged, if you don't have connections with the politicians or if you don't have deep pockets, this isn't really a great place to live. I mean, I'm going to say that as a long-term Philadelphian. If you are a low income or if you don't have resources, this isn't really the best place. But if you do have those resources, this might be a great place. And so I think what we're trying to do is make sure that Philly can be a great place for everyone. But right now it's not. There's a lot of people who are just really falling between the cracks. It makes you feel like you're worth less than the people that they're bringing in or the people who are moving here, and they're valued more somehow because you don't have that degree, you don't have this, you don't have that. So yeah.
You can keep zooming out until you arrive at the basic premise of housing in our country. It's a commodity. Zoning laws dictate what gets built and where. Those decisions feed into many of America's major conversations about race, class, history, and how big the government's role should be in our lives. White says those are steep hills to climb with people who don't agree with you or share your life experiences.
I think the way the discourse happens, especially online, is very, very toxic, and it doesn't really lend itself to hearing the other person out and having a nuanced conversation. It's just you end up just screaming at the other person and trying to get them to understand your point of view. And then when you feel like they're not understanding, you get frustrated, and then people start name calling and blah, blah, blah.
It sounds like you have a bit of antipathy for YIMBYs. Would you consider yourself a NIMBY?
I wouldn't say I'm either. I'm more, we need to have a different kind of conversation than the one we're having now about gentrification and displacement.
Ultimately, White thinks the heat between neighbors is misplaced and should be directed towards policymakers.
We can have a different kind of economic and social system if we wanted to have it. We don't have to accept all of this crap that's going on. And I feel like that's part of what's happening with this pushback against this development is people are just tired of feeling pushed around. They're tired of people telling us that we can't have affordable housing when you just see constantly buildings going up and corporations aren't paying taxes. University of Pennsylvania isn't paying taxes. Kids can't afford to go to college in this city, but there's constantly an influx of students moving here to go to college. So it's what's really going on?
There's vitriol that happens on the YIMBY side, too. Taylor Kessinger says at times, Protect Squirrel Hill is made out to be a group of rich homeowners who aren't concerned about affordability.
When actually it's, as far as I know, mostly a coalition of low-income renters, and it's kind of silly. It's all kind of silly, honestly. Folks need to focus more on the substantive content of what people are saying and less on trying to mind read what their motives are. It's very easy to see why this has a personal dimension to so many people. And part of that personal dimension means that it's very easy to see opponents as having an ulterior motive that's impure, shall we say. I'm not drawing a paycheck from this. I'm not wealthy. most of these folks, I think, just have the sincere belief that if more housing gets built, that's better for everyone.
But Kessinger agrees with White that debate over how to provide affordable housing needs serious, urgent commitment from leaders.
City council members are accountable to the folks who currently live in the district, not to the folks who could live in the district 5 or 10 years down the road. So there's a natural incentive for them to be kind of anti-development and anti-allowing more people to live in the city. And I think, unfortunately, this often comes at the expense of folks who do currently live in the city.
And Ron White's days in Philadelphia are numbered. He's moving to Germany soon to be with his partner and is not feeling particularly nostalgic about his life here.
I'm going to say, honestly, I do feel worn down. I do feel like the lack of empathy for low income and black people in the city, it's worn me down. So I've had people say to me before, either online or at some protest, if you don't like the United States, just get out of here. I'm just like, okay, well, you won. Like, I'm leaving. It's fine. And it's messed up. I mean, this is my own personal situation. It's not like that for everyone. But I do feel like, why stay and keep struggling and fighting when we're not getting the support that we need?
White describes Philadelphia as a city of contrasts. It's where you'll find world-class academics and schools where students breathe in asbestos. A city known for brotherly love with one of the highest rates of gun violence in the country. Once the workshop of the world, the city is now writing its next chapter. While talking with Claudia Aiken of the University of Pennsylvania, I asked her if we actually know whether new construction leads to displacement.
There has been oodles and oodles of research around, is gentrification real? And the results have been mixed. Some researchers have found that we can't actually see displacement, or have argued, okay, maybe some people get displaced, but, is there a counterbalancing benefit to the people who are allowed to stay? And it turns out these things are really, really hard to measure.
And similarly, when it comes to the YIMBY theory, that more housing leads to more affordability.
I think what we've seen is, in reality, is that process takes a really long time, and the shortage of housing is so great that we can't just build housing at any price level we want and think it's going to solve the problem, because it's not. You need to actually build truly affordable housing in order to address housing affordability. We're just at that point of the crisis.
We define affordable housing differently in different places. In an urban housing market, affordable might be an apartment for nearly $1,000 a month. For millions of people in rural cities and towns, a manufactured home is an affordable avenue to home ownership. About 22 million Americans live in manufactured homes that can offer cost-effective housing options. But across the country, there's a new wave of pressure facing residents who live in mobile home parks. They are facing sudden rent increases, sometimes brought on by new ownership and investments in facility improvements. In rural regions, some people are being priced out of even modest housing options. Jessica Lilly has more from Mercer County in southern West Virginia.
On a frigid, late December day, 19-year-old Kayla Thompson and her stepdad, Eddie Woodward, take a break as they load up most of their belongings into a moving truck.
Oh, yeah. We've already got our place set up. We're packing up.
$150 less in rent. We've been out of power for a month and a half.
Kayla and her stepdad say without electricity, they had no heat.
Bundle up. It's the best we got at the moment, which is why we're moving.
Moving vans frequented the Gardner Estates mobile home community since October. That's when residents of the park found out their lot rent amounts would more than triple. A company with properties in 22 states called Homes of America, LLC, purchased 5 manufactured home parks in Mercer County within about the last year. Gardner Estates is one of those parks. In a statement, Sandy Kinney, an attorney for the company, says it is making substantial investments to improve these long-neglected properties so the residents live in places they are proud to call home.
I just take it day by day.
Gary Cooper lives in Delaney Mobile Home Park, another property now owned by Homes of America, about 19 miles across the county. He's facing a rent increase of more than 200%, but he wants to stay in his home, which he takes pride in.
I was getting ready to make some macaroni and like spaghetti.
That's a lot of macaroni.
Oh, I got this at the food bank.
Cooper started going to the food bank almost a year ago, right after his mother died. He took care of her in his home during the last days of her life.
She was 101 when she passed. My grandmother was 104 and she passed. And I cleaned her closets out. I cleaned my closets out and put all my clothes in there.
Yeah.
And then there. So it wouldn't look so lonesome.
Cooper says his family has heard lots of empty promises from previous property owners.
Before these people took over, the other people come through like a ball of fire. The woman said, we're going to clean this up. We're going to take that trailer that's been sitting there for 6 years, and we're going to clean this trailer up, park up, and we're going to get rid of all this junk in these yards. They ain't do nothing.
Cooper owns his home and pays a monthly lot rent. In October, he found a note taped to his banister that said his lot rent would go up from $170 to $525 per month. Cooper's on a fixed income and was struggling even before this increase.
Because I don't get but $1,565 a month. That's paying lot rent, light bill, car insurance, and trailer insurance. Luckily, the car is paid off. I'd never make it.
Now, Cooper says he goes without to make ends meet. Many of the residents in these mobile home communities are on a fixed income. Manufactured homes cater to low-income residents, according to the Manufactured Housing Institute. They now make up about 10% of the housing market. That can be an important alternative at a time when there's a chronic shortage of affordable housing. Paula Parker lives in another mobile home park in Mercer County with her elderly mom.
I mean, we couldn't afford anywhere else, and we moved out this way closer to my daughter.
They moved to Elkview Mobile Home Park about 3 years ago.
Yeah, me and my mother. She's disabled, and she's on oxygen, and she's had a lot of health problems, and I helped take care of her.
The ownership of Elkview has changed twice in the past 3 years. It's another one of the parks now owned by Homes of America. Parker's latest lease calls for $200 a month to rent the lot. Then she pays another $400 a month in a rent-to-own lease for the mobile home.
We moved here, and probably about a few months later, she didn't even tell us that they sold the place. We just had somebody show up and say that we had new owners.
According to that lease, Parker would own the trailer in 2026. But with the new owner's lot rate increase, she's worried things could change.
We don't know whether that this is considered valid, because if they go and raise the lot rent even higher, we can't afford any more than what we're paying.
And she's not even sure who to ask or how to get in touch with them.
We just like to know who we're dealing with, because we're writing a check for $600 and we're putting it over there in the drop box, and who's it actually going to? They just tell us to make it out to Elkview Mobile Home Park.
Homes of America now owns 5 Mercer County mobile home parks: Elkview, Gardner, Delaney, Country Roads, and Shadowwood. Adam Wolf is a staff attorney with Mountain State Justice.
And one of our main areas of focus is consumer law and affordable housing for West Virginians.
Residents reached out to the nonprofit law firm after receiving letters explaining that lot rates would more than double in about 60 days.
I mean, these are people who can't fight for themselves, people who may not be sophisticated enough to know what to ask for from a $1 billion out-of-state corporation with tons of lawyers.
Mountain State Justice organized a public meeting. More than 200 people showed up looking for answers and protections under the law, and they really didn't find much.
I think that is one of the problems and why this private equity company has chosen West Virginia and other states to do this, because there aren't a lot of protections for people living in manufactured housing.
Looking for some financial relief for residents, Mountain State Justice filed a temporary restraining order, which would have protected residents from paying increased rent prices. The legal action also questioned if the company had proper permits to operate.
We wanted the judge to say that since they weren't permitted to operate, that they shouldn't be entitled to collect rent file eviction proceedings, the things you would do if you were properly licensed.
The judge denied the restraining order, but did order the company to fix any health hazards, like standing water or leaking sewage. Those were concerns residents presented in court. Homes of America applied for operating permits in October 2022. The Mercer County Health Department issued a permit to at least one of the mobile home parks in December. On a bitterly cold late December day, Matthew Bragg inspects the Elkview Mobile Home Park, his clipboard in hand.
It needs to be picked up.
Bragg's been the lead sanitarian in Mercer County for about 7 years. He checks for health and safety requirements. Current state law requires a yearly inspection of mobile home parks.
Sewage, water issues, water on the site, proper grading, condition of roads and driveways, trash, litter, those sorts of things.
Frigid winter days usually aren't the time representatives from the health department do outdoor inspections. This trip is part of the court order.
We're specifically looking for water on the site, drainage, sewage issues. When we went out this time, that was the main crux of the complaint before the court.
Bragg found issues during the inspections at Elkview, Gardner, and Delaney.
There is a need for upgraded and fixed drainage off the site when it comes to surface waters. There's a need to put in some deeper trenches, maybe put in some drainage features on pretty much all the mobile home parks.
A regional manager from Homes of America was present for each inspection but declined to answer any questions. The company's lawyer, Sandy Kinney, says it expects to correct the minor compliance issues and will continue efforts to improve the parks for residents. County Inspector Matthew Bragg says some of the current challenges could be prevented if Mercer County adopted federal and state building codes.
We have a need in southern West Virginia for a code enforcement or the adoption of the state code, which is more in depth even than what the health code would be for mobile home parks.
The state of West Virginia has adopted the International Building Code, and each county and municipality has the option to do the same. So far, Mercer County has not adopted the state code.
If it could be more enforceable from a regulatory side of the house, it would make it easier for us to get stuff fixed. As it is now, in most cases, the corrections will not be made unless we absolutely positively bear down on the owners of these mobile home parks.
And the ownership of many mobile home parks across the country has changed significantly in the past 5 years as investors have purchased them. In some cases, new owners raise rents and fees, and there aren't many protections for renters.
You know, a lot of the problems that we have is the lack of accountability.
Mercer County Commissioner Greg Puckett argues he would also like to see more regulations in the county. Puckett says county zoning laws could help to prevent some of the challenges.
If we don't know what's coming, we can't help provide in the knowledge of what needs to build up around. Do you see what I'm saying?
New zoning laws would require property owners to build communities close to existing resources like schools and water treatment plants, or at least notify the county of the need for additional services.
Because without zoning and without proper land use and permitting and things like that, in situations like this, we have no jurisdiction on what can be done in those locations. We can't tell people to build a certain way. We can't tell people to take care of their land in a certain way. And we don't have the protections for the people that live in those communities either.
Puckett also wants the county to adopt ordinances that would require collaborative agreements with property owners like mobile home operators. He wants the owners to notify the county when they plan to raise rents by a certain percentage. For now, Mountain State Justice has filed a class action lawsuit against Homes of America, LLC. They're representing residents who are suing for damages.
We'll be seeking damages on it related to violations of, terms of the leases that those residents have and the illegal terms that are in those leases, that we believe are in those leases.
Wolf says the case presents a great example of the kind of legislation work needed to protect mobile home park residents.
It's one of the things that we're looking at for this current upcoming session is to advocate for some protections for, a great number of people that have been affected in southern West Virginia and are being affected all over this country.
Wolf says West Virginia should join with other states like California and Delaware. He He wants the state to put laws on the books that provide protections for mobile home park residents.
That's Jessica Lilly reporting from Mercer County, West Virginia. When Jessica first told me about this story, I thought about when Ron White lost his Philadelphia apartment to rent eviction. People in America talk all the time about the rural-urban divide. But if I've learned anything from working on this episode, it's that affordable housing is harder and harder to come by, no matter where you live. I brought this up to Claudia Aiken at the University of Pennsylvania.
You know, in places like Philadelphia, we have an opportunity. It's a chance to make things better. And nationally, too. So we've just had this huge amount of federal funding thrown at housing for the first time in so long. And I think it opened lots of people's eyes to how important housing stability is, how maybe housing should be a right, not some good that you buy and trade on a market. How maybe we all need shelter, you know, not just for the sake of our public health, but for social good.
We started this episode with me panting on a steep upclimb near my old neighborhood in Charleston, West Virginia. From what I can tell, America's housing market is in for more huffing and puffing. It's likely we'll see headlines that suggest some fluctuation in rental rates. They went up for much of the past 2 years, but some reports suggest the highest number of multifamily housing units in decades are likely to hit the market this year. That could mean a drop in rental rates in some markets. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode was me, Trey Kay, Christina Stella, Jessica Lilly, and Kate Smith. Michael Lipton, Tristan Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.